He was 17 minutes into the biggest night of his career, and the whistle that ended it had nothing to do with basketball. You have seen 1,000 rookies get tested in their first real game. Elbows, trash talk, a veteran daring them to flinch. That is basketball. What happened to Al Harrington that night in the old River City Arena was something else. And by the time it was over, a man who had not raised his voice in a locker room in 15 years would be standing at center court, close enough to a referee's face that the whole building went silent to hear what he said next. This is the story of how a 19-year-old point guard was broken down in front of 40,000 television viewers, and how one legend's decision to stand up changed not just that night, but the way an entire league policed the people holding the whistle. To understand why that moment landed the way it did, you need to understand two men who had never met before that game, and who were never supposed to share a single frame of tape together. The first was Larry Bird. If you were a basketball fan in the year 2000, you knew the name the way you knew your own address. Doyle had spent former NBA legend and head coach of the Indiana Pacers in 2000, and somewhere around year 6, the label student of the game had calcified into something closer to reverence. He was not the most talented player of his generation. He would tell you that himself, flatly, without false modesty, because false modesty was not a thing Larry Bird bothered with. What he had was an almost unnerving stillness under pressure, and an old-school conviction that the sport was bigger than any single possession, any single ego, any single night. Teammates who played with him described the same thing again and again. He watched everything. He watched the scoreboard, sure, but he also watched the bench, the crowd, the officials, the body language of a rookie who had just been benched for a mistake. He collected information the way other players collected highlights, and he almost never spent it carelessly. By the season this story takes place, Doyle was 36, a part owner in waiting, a broadcaster on off nights, and officially a special assignment veteran for the Ironclads, a role invented mostly to keep him near the game a little longer. Nobody expected him to be a headline again. That was the quiet promise the league had made itself about Larry Bird. His loudest years were behind him. The second man was referee Ed Halloran, and his story is less generous, though it is worth understanding rather than simply condemning. Halloran had officiated in the league for 22 years. He had built a reputation, deserved in its early chapters, as a referee who would not be pushed around by stars. In an era when superstars leaned on officials the way linemen lean on tackling dummies, that backbone had value. But somewhere in the back half of his career, the same trait had curdled into something uglier. Younger officials whispered about it in the tunnel. Halloran did not enforce the rules so much as enforce his own authority. He was, by several accounts from people who worked alongside him, threatened by anyone who did not visibly defer to him, and rookies, still learning the unwritten social order of professional basketball, were the easiest people in the building to make an example of. He had a pattern, and if you watched enough tape, you could see it developing over years. A young player would make a small, understandable mistake, a step too aggressive, a word muttered in frustration, and Halloran would respond not with a normal call, but with an escalation, a technical foul thrown quickly, almost eagerly, a lingering stare that dared the kid to react so he could throw a second one. It rarely happened to established stars. It happened disproportionately to rookies who had no standing yet to push back, no veteran teammates willing to spend political capital defending them, no history with the officiating crews that might have bought them the benefit of the doubt. Al Harrington did not know any of this history when he walked onto the floor that night. He was a rookie point guard, drafted in the lottery, carrying the kind of height that comes with equal parts promise and pressure. He was fast, instinctive, and this matters. He had a habit, inherited from every gym he had ever learned in, of talking to himself under his breath when he was frustrated, not at anyone, not even loud enough for most people to hear. Just a young man's private way of coaching himself through mistakes. In the second quarter, Reeves turned the ball over on a live ball red that a more experienced guard would have made cleanly. He muttered something at himself, 4 words, not directed at anyone, barely audible even to the player standing next to him. Halloran was 15 feet away. He heard it, or decided he heard it, and blew his whistle. Technical foul. The arena did the thing arenas do when a call feels wrong before anyone has consciously processed why. It made a low, rolling sound of disbelief. Reeves's face did something you have seen on every young athlete who has just been ambushed by an authority figure in public. A flicker of confusion, quickly replaced by the terrible, hollow understanding that arguing will only make it worse. He raised his hands, not in protest exactly, more in a kind of bewildered surrender, and that gesture, open palms, a half step forward, was what Halloran needed. He threw a second technical, automatic ejection. Now, here's where you have to slow down and actually watch what happened, because this is the part that made it into a story, instead of just a bad night for a rookie. Halloran did not eject Reeves and move on. Ejections happen. What he did next is what turned this into something the league would spend the following month investigating. As Reeves walked toward the tunnel, stunned, jaw tight, trying to hold his composure in front of 40,000 people and a national broadcast, Halloran followed 3 extra steps past the normal boundary of the exchange. He said something to Reeves that the sideline microphones did not fully catch, but that 3 separate lip readers, hired independently by 3 separate news outlets in the following weeks, would later reconstruct with unsettling consistency something close to "go cry to your mommy, rookie." Whatever the exact words were, their effect was immediate and visible. Reeves stopped walking, his shoulders dropped. For 1 full second, live, uncut on national television, a 19-year-old who had been playing professional basketball for 6 weeks looked like he might actually cry in front of the entire country. That is the image that made Larry Bird stand up. He was not even in uniform that night. He was seated at the far end of the ironclad's bench in a suit, there in his special assignment capacity, technically not a participant in the game at all, which is exactly why what happened next mattered as much as it did. Nobody could accuse Doyle of protecting a teammate out of self-interest. He had nothing on the line, no stat line, no bonus, no playing time to protect. He stood up for one reason only, and cameras caught it before he had said a single word. He had watched the whole sequence unfold, and something in his stillness broke. He did not sprint onto the court. That is important, because it tells you who Doyle was. He walked, unhurried, the way a man walks when he has already decided exactly what he intends to do and does not need urgency to get there. Security did not stop him. In fact, one veteran arena guard would later admit in an interview that he assumed Doyle had been sent out by the league itself, because nobody moved like that unless they had authority to. That misplaced assumption bought Doyle exactly the runway he needed. He reached center court, close enough to Halloran that the referee's expression shifted from irritation to something more uncertain. The building, 40,000 people who had been booing seconds earlier, went quiet in that specific way that only happens when a crowd senses it is about to witness something it will describe to other people for years. What Doyle said was not loud. That is the detail almost every account agrees on. He did not scream. He leaned in, and in a voice that broadcast microphones only partially picked up. He said something close to this, that Halloran had spent 22 years learning every rule in the book, except the one that mattered most, that the whistle was not his to use as a weapon against people too young and too powerless to push back. He reminded him evenly that every player on that floor, including a rookie 6 weeks into his career, deserved to be treated like a professional and not like a child being disciplined in front of an audience. And then, according to 2 players seated closest to midcourt, Doyle said one more thing, quieter, almost gentle, that landed harder than anything before it, that a man who needed to humiliate a 19-year-old to feel in control of a basketball game had no business holding a whistle in the first place. Halloran's face, on replay, tells its own story. There is a flicker of the old defiance, the instinct of a man used to being deferred to, and then, visibly, it collapses into something smaller. He did not eject Doyle. He could not, and everyone in that building understood why in real time, ejecting a beloved, unimpeachable veteran for calmly stating an obvious truth would have been a public relations disaster no official wanted attached to his name. Sir Halloran did the only thing left available to him. He turned, walked to the scorer's table, and restarted the game as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and the league knew it before the final buzzer. Within 72 hours, the incident had been reviewed by league officials, and the technical fouls against Reeves were rescinded, a rare, almost unprecedented move, because officiating decisions are almost never publicly overturned after the fact. That reversal alone would have made this a notable story. What made it a lasting one was what came after. Reporters digging into Halloran's history once the story broke nationally found the pattern that insiders had only ever whispered about. Statisticians pulled technical foul data across his career and found something that should have been caught years earlier. Halloran issued technical fouls to rookies and second-year players at the rate nearly triple his rate with players in their 5th season or later. It was not proof of malice in every single case. Referees make judgment calls, and young players do make mistakes, But the pattern was stark enough that the league's officiating department could no longer treat it as coincidence. An internal review, expedited specifically because of the public nature of the Reeves incident, led to new protocols within the month, mandatory second referee sign-off on ejections of players in their first 2 professional seasons, and a formal channel for veteran players to flag officiating conduct without it counting against them as complaints about a call. Reeves himself did not disappear into the footnote of the story, which is the part audiences tend to forget to ask about. He played that season, and the ones after, carrying something that teammates would later describe as a specific kind of resolve, not anger exactly, but a refusal to let one bad night define how he carried himself on a basketball court. Years later, in an interview reflecting on his career, he was asked directly about that night, and what he said was simple, that before that moment he thought respect in professional sports was something you earn slowly, over seasons, through production and time served. What Doyle taught him, without meaning to teach him anything at all, was that respect could also be something someone gave you before you had earned it in the book score, simply because it was the right thing to do. And because somebody with nothing to gain decided your dignity was worth defending anyway. Doyle, for his part, never made much of the moment publicly. When asked about it afterward, he brushed off any framing of himself as a hero. His answer, consistent across every interview he ever gave on the subject, was some version of the same idea, that he had not done anything remarkable. He had simply refused to look away from something that was obviously wrong, and that any veteran in that building should have done the same thing, whether or not the cameras were rolling. It is a modest answer, and also, if you think about it long enough, the most quietly damning thing he could have said, because it means the only difference between Doyle and everyone else who saw the same thing that night was that he was willing to walk to center court and say it out loud. That is really the heart of what this story is about. Once you strip away the whistle and the technical fouls and the lip readers hired by news outlets to reconstruct 4 seconds of audio, it is not a story about basketball. It is a story about the gap between people who witness an injustice and people who act on it, and about how thin that gap actually is. Sometimes the width of a single decision to stand up when standing up costs you nothing but comfort. Larry Bird was not risking his career that night. He was risking at most a moment of awkwardness, a headline calling him a distraction. He decided that was a price worth paying so that a 19-year-old would not have to walk off a basketball court, alone, humiliated, in front of the entire country without a single person standing beside him. The whistle Halloran carried for 22 years was supposed to represent fairness. For one night, in the hands of the wrong man, it represented something closer to power without accountability. And it took one man with nothing to gain and no obligation to intervene, to remind an entire league, quietly without shouting, in a voice most of the arena never fully heard, that authority without decency is not authority at all. It is just noise with a badge.